everybody. Oh, that's better. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the annual Beyond the Bars conference. It's been a long time, right? It's been such a long time. I am a little emotional. Looking out and seeing everyone's faces after all that we've had to go through over the past couple of years. To be here, what an honor it is to sit here in community, in fellowship, and in struggle with all of you. What an honor, what a joy. I want to start with a quick introduction from my little person. This is our junior Beyond the Bars fellow, Jamaica.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamaica Brown, and I hope everyone is doing well today. I've been participating with Beyond the Bars since I can remember, and for a 10-year-old, that's a long time. One thing that has stuck with me is the importance of youth in this fight for justice. We have to continue to fight until we are all afforded the freedoms that are supposedly guaranteed to us. This is the time, and this is the day that we move towards change. Here are 3 things that have stuck with me over the years. 1, there can be no justice without gender justice. There can be no liberation without queer and trans liberation. And all the struggles are connected. I hope everyone enjoys the conference and takes away the things that will help them continue the fight for justice.
So my name is Shonda Chapman. I have also been involved in Beyond the Bars for a very long time. This is my political home. It's my social home. This is a family in many ways. So again, I'm really, really thrilled to be here. When Cameron first asked me if I might MC, my first thought was, well, where's Yolanda? Ain't that Yolanda's job? Where's Yolanda at? But that's okay. I'm here, and I feel a little bit like someone invited me to make the potato salad at the family reunion. It's a big job. So bear with me. To kick us off, we're going to start with the land acknowledgement from our dear brother, George Stonefish. If you'd make your way up, George, and I'll tell you a little bit about George. George is a lifelong resident of New York City and a well-known singer, dancer, artist, and speaker. He is a First Nation American Indian who is 1/2 Lenape, 1/4 Ottawa, 1/8 Ojibwa, 1/6 Potawatomi, 1/16 Miami, and from Ontario, Canada. However, he was raised in New York City and told me personally that he was from the hood. So we welcome George.
Well, I look beyond and I see all of you. And I feel so honored to be invited to these days' doings. And Beyond the Bars, when I was first approached to do this, I was saying, oh my God, do I want to? I mean, they're beyond the bars. Does that mean they were in the bars? Well, guess what? I'm a Rockefeller drug convictee. I did 16 years to life in the state of New York in the maximum security prisons of Sing Sing and Auburn. I was a CMC. I never saw the light of day of a medium or a minimum security prison in New York. They kept me in maxes because they thought I was dangerous. I'm a nice fella. And more importantly, I'm considered a Lenape because my mother was a Lenape. And we come from a matriarchal society where, get this, women rule. They elect our chiefs of each clan. They are responsible for maintaining that they continue the work for the people. Should they not, they have the authority and power to dehorn, and the horns on the gastoa or the headpiece are a symbol of the authority of a chief, and they have the right to remove them and to put somebody else in their spot. They are head of our political system. They are also the ones that, now you got a whole listing of nations I was in. My mother was half Lenape. My father was Ottawa, Chippewa, Potawatomi, and Miami. But that doesn't count in our community. What counts is my mother's lineage as a Lenape. So that's what I'm looked at is in my community. In addition to which, the clan that I belong to, which is the Turtle Clan, is passed down by the mother or my mother. My father was Wolf, but that has no bearing. My mother was a turtle, and that's what I am. That's where I sit in our political system, because we still have the clan system of our elective systems of government, where all of the turtles sit with one another, all of the wolves, all of the snipes, or whatever clans exist in a particular Indian's nation. And based on this, we follow the mother's line. The mother owns the property. The women own the property in a marriage. When I got married to my wife, who was an Ojibwe, I was expected to go live with the Ojibways on the Thames in Ontario, Canada, and not bring her to my reservation because that's where we go. And if I was ever saw fit to divorce her and didn't get killed, I would just leave with my clothes. She continues with all the property and everything else it takes to bear and raise the children because she runs that household. And myself and my wife have been together 44 years. So I learned early on who ran the household, and it wasn't me. But I come from a culture and society where I was learned that that was the regular thing. That was what was expected. So even though I was raised here in Manhattan, on the Upper East Side, on 82nd between Park and Madison, and went to PS6 Wagner Junior High School and the Bronx High School of Science, I still maintain my culture because every summer I would go spend it with my traditional grandparents in Canada and learn my tradition, my ceremonies, my language. So I grew up with a duality, where the most important facet of my life is my native heritage. It is how I have raised my children, and raised my grandchildren, and raised my great-grandchildren, because I'm a great-grandfather. And I don't like children. But all of my grandchildren and so forth, they all know that, so they all say they're young adults. And they behave like it, so it's great. Now, as a Lenape, things have been happening recently. This whole concept of land acknowledgements has become something that's spreading. I do land acknowledgements now for the UN, for Columbia University, for the graduations, for their, when they bring the students in and they introduce them to the university, they bring me in to do a land acknowledgement before their doings. Different colleges throughout the United States, actually, and a lot of organizations who are forthright and understand their responsibilities to Turtle Island, to Mother Earth, have started to do land acknowledgements before their doings. So I'm brought in, and I enjoy doing it. I sing with the Silver Cloud Singers. We're a championship intertribal Southern style drum, and we sing all over the world, and it's all following our tradition. I also sing at ceremonies, and I'm involved with my people. So even though I'm retired these days, I still probably work more than most people. And in that light, when I do a land acknowledgement, I could come up here and I could speak for 5 minutes in Lenape. you guys would say, oh, cool, wouldn't know a word of what I was saying. So I prefer to do the prayer for land acknowledgement in English, because I believe it should be a teaching experience where you should go away from us knowing more about Native American, knowing more about yourself and your responsibilities to Mother Earth. Well, let me do the prayer. Creator, I want to thank you for the earth, moon, stars, who will continue to follow the directions as handed down by you and provide for all of creation through light, through heat, through guidance, and continue to do their duties. I'd like to give thanks to the moon, or to the wind and the thunder beings who continue to follow their directions as handed down by the Creator, you. And I like to give thanks to the winged creatures who fly to and fro and continue to fulfill their role with regard to the entire spectrum of world and continue to follow their directions. I'd like to give thanks to the trees and the foliage that cover Turtle Island, or what we call Mother Earth, and how they continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. I'd also like to give thanks to the four-legged creatures who run and provide with their sacrifice by giving us their meat, their fur, for us to protect ourselves, to give us sustenance, and continue their instructions as followed by the Creator. I'd also like to give a moment of silence for those things I may have missed, so that you in your own minds can put them in. And if I have missed anything because of my young age, I'd like you all to fill that gap and to understand your role with regard to Earth, that the winged creatures, the four-leggeds, the thunder beings, the moon and stars, they're all your brothers and sisters. They're of equal footing to us, and we should never believe that we control or that we dominate them, because we continue to follow our instructions as handed down by the Creator. Now, that is the shortest prayer for Native Americans in the world. If you were coming to a ceremony and one of our elders got up to do the prayer, well, you're sitting there for an hour and a half or 2 hours. Because they go into detail, everything from the chipmunks to the pigeons and what they do and how they fulfill their instructions as handed down by the Creator. But I give this small little touch of understanding to you, because one thing I want you to realize is in that prayer, I never asked for anything. I only gave thanks to what we have. And this is the way that we have looked upon life and earth. And when you talk about Native beliefs and religion, you can't say they're all the same, because they aren't. Because here, we have ceremonies for strawberries, for green corn, for specific things in our environment. Whereas the Indians in New Mexico, they don't have those things. They give thanks for piña nuts and those things that provide sustenance for them in that area. So each of the prayers are different according to the area in which we evolved in. Because we were here a long time. Our people evolved from this earth, which we call Turtle Island. And we are on her back. And we have to respect that. Now, going that far, you also have to understand that when we pray and give thanks, we give thanks for all of creation, our men, our women, especially our women, because they are the ones that provide us with guidance. My role as a man, as an Indian warrior, is to protect them, to provide for sustenance for them, and to listen and to behave. The last thing I've always had a problem with, but I've been trying. Now, we want to talk about Lenape because this is Lenape territory. From below Albany, all the way down the east coast to what is now called Delaware, that was all Lenape territory, including out into the island. The Shinnecock and the Poospatuck, the Canarsie, they were all our allies, and they were part of our Confederacy. When you go north, the Pequot, all the way up to Maine and the Wampanoag, they were all our allies. We were all one group, and we basically all spoke the same root language, Algonquin, but each nation had different enunciations for different things. But we were all of one mind. We all worked together. And we were here when the English and Dutch first arrived. The Lenape were the ones that extended hands of friendship to these people from faraway lands. And when we saw the condition they were in and their inability to understand this continent of Turtle Island, we provided them with the knowledge to plant all of these vegetables and things that they had never seen before, like potatoes, like sweet potatoes, like corn. All of these were introduced by us to them. They did not belong to you. The Irish ended up loving our potatoes. And in fact, when they had the Irish potato famine, the Choctaw gave them $100,000 to feed their poor. And it's taught in Irish history, but not here in the United States. Here in the United States, if you ask most people who walk around this island, who were the first native people the original inhabitants from Europe came in contact with, they wouldn't know. They only know they were some group that sold Manhattan for $24. All of this was history that was created by the victors and not the true history of this continent. And by doing land acknowledgement, you learn about us. My people were from this area. My group of Lenape originally were from this area. And we extended our hands of friendship and enabled them to survive when they first came and set foot on this continent because they didn't have the wares in their ships. They had eaten them all. They were starving. They were going to die. But we allowed them to live by showing them the different things here that they had no understanding of and gave them a foothold on this Turtle Island. And all we asked of them is that they keep their ways to themselves and respect our ways. And they did for a while, as long as they needed us. But when they saw our communities and how they were thriving and how we had huge plants, and how we used to go and plant the Three Sisters, bean, corn, and squash, together in one plot, so that one would keep the bugs away, one would provide stalks for the others to grow on, and one would provide nutrients for the land so that each of the benefits or the results of their growth were larger than what you see today, because that was the proper way to do it. When we taught them this, and they saw our communities, they soon got jealous. And they would attack us and massacre us and chase us from these territories so they could steal our land. And my people were attacked and forced from this land all the way down south through Kansas, what is now Kansas, into Oklahoma. And then they were chased from Oklahoma up all the way up through the United States into Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. And they finally crossed over after being massacred, because we would go and settle, start a community, start growing things, and start showing them what they could do, and then they would have to come and take it. So we would have to move on. And we would go through this process of being massacred by these new interlopers to our continent until we got to Michigan and we crossed over into Ontario, what is now Ontario, and went up the Thames River. And that was our final massacre. They came up and chased us because we had Tecumseh with us, a great Indian warrior who was trying to organize the Indian nations to fight against the interlopers. So they came to massacre him and massacred us, and we ended up staying on that area on the Thames River up in Ontario. It was a long journey, but we got to where we are now, and we still have territory up there. And the funny thing is, 40 miles north on the Thames River, there's another Lenape territory, Muncie. And they went through a similar journey that we did, except they came through Niagara Falls, not Michigan, and came down the Thames River to where they were at. So all of our Indian nations that now exist, the two settlements, the two federally recognized settlements in Oklahoma, in Anadarko and in Bartlesville, and the settlement in Wisconsin, a federally recognized settlement. All of these settlements went through a horrendous journey and travels to get where they are now. The only Lenape you have near this area are two state-recognized tribes in New Jersey, one in the Ramapo Mountains and one all the way down on the border with Delaware called the Nanacoke. Now these are true Lenape. They practice the big house, which is our religion, and they're not recognized by the federal government because we're too close to valuable land, and the federal government don't want to give us our due respect. But things are changing. We're coming together. We're working together. I'm helping to organize them here in New York State and get each of their journeys of dispossession put in one place and establish a basic museum so I can teach the inhabitants of this area the true history. And you can see the trials and tribulations we have gone to remain who we are. Now, many people want to look at Native people and say, well, they don't practice the same religion. As I said earlier, no. The only thing we really have in common is the one root of our beliefs, and that is the concept of respect. Respect for ourselves, respect for our nuclear family, no other way to call them that, respect for our clan, and our clan people are all considered brothers and sisters. I cannot marry a Turtle Clan member. That's barred. That's incest. To respect the nation that we're from, the Lenape in my case. To respect the confederacy of all the Lenape nations. And then to respect the United States. By this concept of respect being the root and basis for all of the Native beliefs on this Turtle Island, we have found the strength to survive all of the different programs by the federal government, the programs of assimilation, the boarding schools where they took our young from us and tried to turn them into white people by not allowing them to speak their languages and beating them if they did so, to where they put us on where they would send us to different cities to try to assimilate us. We have continued to survive. We still speak our language. We still believe in our way of life. It's not a religion to us, because it's something that we believe and practice in every waking day of our lives. I even use the beliefs of the great law when I'm on the subway, and some guy steps on my foot and pushes me out of the way. Instead of body slamming him, I look and I respect him and I let him go on his way. Now, I was an Indian activist in the 60s and 70s, and when everything calmed down and I was doing a radio program on WBAI here in the city on Native politics called Drumbeats. At night, I have to admit, I was super fly. I was importing large amounts of cocaine and marijuana into the United States, and I got busted. I got 16 years to life because I had really good attorneys. And I did every moment of that 16 years. But while I was inside, I got a paralegal degree from Mercy College. I got a BA from Syracuse University when I was at Auburn. And I ran Indian religion throughout Auburn and eventually the state because I took Department of Corrections to court. And I beat them every single time I did. In fact, most of the time they wouldn't allow my briefs to hit the court. They would capitulate and give us what we wanted. So now there's Native religious organizations throughout the New York State prison system. They even have a ministerial service member who's a traditional Iroquois person to guide our religion. And we got them to accept that we, as natives, practice the great law and the Iroquois way of life because it's Iroquois territory up there. And that's what should be done. And that gives us a benefit of not having to allow non-natives into our religious beliefs because of the two-row wampum. So I've been involved in a lot of Indian things, and when I came out, I started working in my community again after they got over the initial fear of me, because I was bad before I went in. And after that, I started working in the different organizations. I even got a Soros Fellowship. I was the first Native American to get a Soros Fellowship. In addition to which, I was the first Soros Fellow to get a fellowship while he was on lifetime parole. And I worked as a Indian history and a fundraiser for the Native community at large. Because one of the things I learned to do was write, and write well. So I'm a great fundraiser now. I'm sort of retired, I say, because I'm working with a Ford Foundation grant to put together the histories of dispossession of the Lenape from Oklahoma to Wisconsin and Canada and throughout the New Jersey area, and put them all in one place so that we can teach all of you the true history of this land. And saying that, and having you understand, from my perspective, there is life after prison if you so desire and want it. When I got out, I wore being an ex-con on my sleeve. I never tried to hide it. I always put it out there up front, so I gave people the choice and opportunity to work with me or not. If they didn't work with me, they were at a loss because I was good at what I did and what I do. And so I've worked for my community here in the city. I've worked for youth programs throughout the United States who come and bring me in to talk to the Indian youth. And I see somebody moving to my left, so I think I'm being kicked off the stage. I don't even have to be touched. I can feel them because I'm a Native American. This is the spirit power that we have. Now, what did you want? Oh, I got a whole 2 minutes. Woo-hoo! So as you see, I'd like to just end by closing and saying, as your landlord, welcome. And I am proud of what you are doing for those of us who made an error and want to change our ways. That you are there to provide comfort, guidance, and the ability to turn our lives around. Because we have so much knowledge to give to our young. And I'm sorry to say, our young will listen to an old ex-con OG Native American like me before they'll listen to somebody who graduated from Columbia School of Social Work. I got more credibility, just as many of you have more credibility, and you should use that And you can use it with those highfalutin, educated people to give you guidance and to give the grantors a reason to give you money. They're useful. Don't forget it. We can work together. That's the whole thing of creating communities, is working together with our different backgrounds. And with this, later, brothers and sisters. Oh, man, I'm going to take a minute here. I'm stealing it. You guys' t-shirt and bag have created a crisis for my drum. Okay. I'm going to sing you a short honor song to celebrate all of you from being here. Very short honor. I know that gave you a tinkle in your back. All right, goodbye.
Thank you for that beautiful, beautiful land acknowledgement, George Stonefish. Thank you so much. You know, one of the things I've learned growing up is sometimes the spirit moves how it needs to move, and you let it move like that, right? Before I introduce our next panel, if you do me one quick favor, look to the neighbor on your right. Look to your neighbor. Say, neighbor, I'm so glad you're here. Now look to the neighbor on your left. If you don't have a neighbor on your left, keep looking at the neighbor on your right. And say, neighbor, I'm so glad you're here. Yes. All right. I'm going to move us right along. We have a very, very, very wonderful first panel for you. And that panel is called Connecting the Struggles, Decarceration, Abolition, Environmental and Climate Justice. Our first panelist, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Our next panelist, Tamisha Walker, is co-founder and executive director of the Safe Return Project. Tamisha has 10 years of community organizing experiences in cities impacted by trauma, mass criminalization, and economic inequality. Kelly Hayes is a Menominee organizer, writer, and direct action trainer based in Chicago. Kelly co-founded the Lifted Voices Collective and the Chicago Light Brigade and was an organizer with We Charge Genocide. And our final panelist, Aline Brown, is an award-winning investigative reporter who covers environmental justice, especially where it intersects with criminalization. I'm going to invite our panelists up, and we're going to get started.
So great to be here. I'm Alice Kim, and I have the pleasure and the honor of moderating this conversation today. I know that we have a bunch, I can't help this, I have to give a shout out to Chicago in the house, because I know there's a lot of Chicagoans here. All right, so I really want to just start by thanking the Center for Justice for inviting all of us to be here today. It's been a hard 2 years, and it's really, really great being in the room with one another, right? And it's really great to be in person with each other. I especially want to give a shout out to Cameron, Cheryl, and Kathy. who I know I've learned so much from over the years, in particular about opening up the university and really claiming university spaces to do the work we need to do, right? So Beyond the Bars really has become a kind of political home to me. I always look forward to this conference. It feels very different from other conferences, especially conferences that are held in academic spaces. So it really, really, really is a pleasure to be here today. So, we decided that we really want to dive right into the conversation and get to the meat of the issues of the day. And so I'm just gonna get us right into it, right? And to start, I wanted to ask each of our panelists to just give a quick little introduction to themselves by saying how they came into this work. So I'm gonna start with Kelly and come this way.
Were we merging that with the first question? I thought we talked about that in the email, our introduction with the first question. So could you share what the first question was?
Sure. Okay, so we're going to ask, folks will discuss and share how they came into this work, and then start by sharing and giving some opening remarks on basically the intersections of this work, right? The intersections of prisons and policing with climate injustice, and also global injustices, and how folks see these intersections in their own work.
Thank you so much. So I don't usually write out what I'm going to say, but I wrote out some opening remarks because there was a lot I wanted to say on that topic specifically. And I'm not going to dive too deeply into who I am. I host a podcast called Movement Memos if y'all want to check it out, but I think that the rest will become apparent. Thank you, and I want to thank the organizers, my co-panelists, and everyone joining us today for being in conversation and for approaching these issues in this moment. I am a Menominee organizer, but I'm a city Indian, and my organizing is generally urban in nature. But in my work as a direct action trainer, I have been around the country, from Standing Rock to Boston and the Pacific Northwest, trying to deconsolidate some of the skills and knowledge that were gifted to me around different tactics, strategies, and principles of doing this work. Now, environmental work is not my primary focus, but my friend Morningstar Galley and I were recently joking about how pretty much every Native organizer we know, no matter what their issue is, has also worked on environmental issues. Why? It's definitely true that our people are prime targets of environmental racism, but it's also true that one of the traditions that this country did not manage to grind out of Native people when it murdered us, scattered us, and banned our religions was our sense of connection to the earth, and our understanding that when you poison the water, or when you eliminate any of the creatures that make up this reality, you are killing us too. When we talk about connections around prisons, police, punishment and safety, and environmental and climate injustices, I feel compelled to talk about time. And I want to begin with a quote from Ruthie, which I hope isn't too strange given that we are both on this panel. But given that her analysis really informs what I want to say today, I want to read this quote from Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence, which is featured in Ruthie's upcoming book, Abolition Geography, which you can all pre-order. Today's prisons are extractive. What does that mean? It means prisons enable money to move because of the enforced inactivity of people locked in them. It means people extracted from communities and people returned to communities but not entitled to be of them enable the circulation of money on rapid cycles. What's extracted from the extracted is the resource of life, time. If we think about this dynamic through the politics of scale, understanding bodies as places, then criminalization transforms individuals into tiny territories primed for the extractive activity to unfold. Extracting and extracting again, time from the territory of selves. This opens up a hole in time, furthering, perhaps to our surprise, the annihilation of space by time. Let's breathe that in for a second. What is at stake today is what has always been at stake. Since our ancestors first resisted the horrors of capitalism, colonialism, chattel slavery, and the genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent and around the world. This apocalypse began in the 16th century. Collapse has been occurring since that time, but in ways that the majority did not view as a global crisis. For the sake of industry, for the sake of expansion, lakes were drained, dams were built, people and animals were poisoned, entire species wiped out, destabilizing ecosystems. This process was ongoing, and as people's capacity to build and reproduce goods and eviscerate land developed, the devastation escalated. I also want to be clear that at every step, indigenous people indigenous to this land have been clear about the stakes and have also offered insights on how to maintain and restore balance to ecosystems. Many of our cultural practices that would have helped keep the earth in balance were banned. Native people went to prison for the practice of cultures that honored our connection to the earth. So that is another important connection to understand. This society did not simply ignore what could have saved it. The very ways of living scientists are now screaming are essential to our salvation were criminalized for generations. When I talk about the violence committed against Native people, including carceral violence, we are talking about the violence of conquest and colonialism, which has evolved over time. This country's earliest military formations were created to annihilate Native populations and seize Native land. Now the military is a global force, doing things in Africa that most people have never heard about. But to this day, military personnel use the phrase in country to describe being in countries where the US military is engaged in active conflict. In country is short for Indian country. The US military is the world's largest single consumer of energy. Every year, the US military consumes more than 100 million barrels of oil. If the military were a country, its emissions would rank among the top 25% of nations. But with the military, we're not just talking about emissions. We're also talking about constant fuel leaks, contaminating water, the varying devastation of a whole array of weapons that annihilate both human beings and the natural world they inhabit. Rehearsals for warfare cause environmental havoc. The military also has a blanket exemption from all global climate agreements. In effect, it has a license to kill the natural world without consequence. Right now, many people are coming to grips with the reality that war is hell, because they are watching a war play out in Ukraine. But the hell-making of our own military is ongoing, because it happens second by second over the course of decades and is obscured from public view. Whether we are talking about white phosphorus, the US deployed in Iraq, or marine mammals dying due to sonar testing, or the poisoning of water that landed 5,000 people in the Yar in Hawaii last year, war games, and the positioning of military resources are incompatible with human freedom and life on Earth. So why am I talking so much about the military? Because everything we experience in this country hinges on the legitimation of military violence and security as the primary purpose and function of governance. If those legitimacies are appropriately undermined, as we saw in 2020 with the police, the political weather could shift suddenly and with great extremity. That is the task before us. Now, I began with Ruthie's quote on time because now we are in the endgame of this apocalyptic process, and the theft of time from the larger populace is becoming more evident. We know that time is extracted from imprisoned people. We know that people who are defending the earth are being criminalized and hyper-criminalized with extreme charges. As recognition of the crisis grows, the stakes go up on all sides. As the pandemic has cruelly reinforced, capitalism will cut losses to maintain itself. Mass death in plain sight is the new normal. Climate denial is giving way to climate security. Rather than denying that we are living in an era of catastrophe and collapse, our enemies are leveraging the crisis as an excuse to box people out. In some ways, I feel as though we are living in a collapsing box, as borders and the extraction of time redraw boundaries of habitability and survival, where more and more people find themselves zoned into death worlds and sacrifice zones. But we must understand that under capitalism, on a long enough timeline, the entire world is a sacrifice zone. Bordering, partitioning, and extraction are the apocalypse. Prisons are the hyper-embodiment of these phenomenon and of what they do to human bodies, as well as the natural world. The fight against prisons and the system that necessitates them is a fight for the future.
So well said, Kelly. Wow. So I came in, I'm Aline, I'm a reporter. I came into this work, in part out of reporting on the criminalization of land and water defense movements. This year, I published a project that looked at the climate crisis inside detention facilities. So looking at where that criminalization leads. For The Intercept, with my collaborator Akil Harris, we mapped the locations of more than 6,500 jails, prisons, ICE detention facilities, juvenile detention facilities against wildfire risk, heat risk, and flood risk. And what we found was that a lot of facilities are facing a lot of risk. A lot of places are already sites of kind of horrific climate impacts, and things are going to get much worse. So we found that more than a third of the detention facilities in the US have historically had more than 50 days a year, have been in counties that have had more than 50 days a year on average with a heat index over 90 degrees. By the end of the century, if massive steps aren't taken to combat the climate crisis, that will go to nearly 3/4 of US carceral institutions. Right now, no carceral institution in the US is located in a county with more than 50 days a year at 105-degree heat index. By 2100, almost 700 facilities will be in that condition, mostly in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. We identified more than 600 facilities that have major to extreme flood risk. We found that about a fifth of California's institutions are above the 95th percentile for wildfire risk in the nation. But we also found that Florida has more state-run facilities facing extreme wildfire risk than California. So this is not something that's just on the West Coast, and that risk is going to increase significantly everywhere. We also spoke to a number of people who are or were incarcerated in horrific conditions or who have loved ones impacted by all of this. We spoke to people who spent more than a month this summer at the California Correctional Center, locked in dark, smoky cells because wildfires had taken down power lines in the area, and the generator for one unit was not working, leaving them without lights or fully functioning ventilation as the surrounding community was preparing to evacuate. Zero information about any evacuation plans were provided even to members of the Inmate Advisory Council, which meets regularly with prison staff. People were really terrified and their health was very impacted. In Texas, we told the story of Justin Phillips, whose kidney condition deteriorated as he sat in a building with no air conditioning, as the heat index outside rose to 127 degrees, or according to the Corrections Department's own records. His wife, Casey's fight for her husband's life led her to start Texas Prisons Air Conditioning Advocates, which the predecessor to Texas Prisons Community Advocates, which is fighting for legislation mandating air conditioning in Texas prisons. As of 2020, only about a third of prisons in the state are fully air conditioned. So that's 70 facilities without full AC, 20 with none. I also spoke to Angel Argueta Anariba, who came to the US escaping Hurricane Mitch in 1998 until he was caught up in the criminal legal system a decade later. After serving a sentence for a crime he attributes to self-defense, he sat in ICE detention for over 7 years. There, he experienced dire conditions at the Catahoula Correctional Center in Louisiana during Hurricane Laura in 2020, which was followed by 2 other storms that same fall. Power failed for 5 days. He and the other people in the facility were left in the dark with no air conditioning, with heat around 100 degrees, he estimates. With the toilets not working, people were forced to defecate on trays that lunch had been served on, which ended up in the trash that guards did not remove for days. He said the smell was excruciating, it made him feel sick, it aggravated his asthma, which was made worse when pepper spray was repeatedly used to, I guess, control evacuees from other facilities in other parts of the facility. So Angel won his bond hearing this Tuesday, and this weekend he is with his family after being in prison, then ICE detention for more than 14 years. So I just want to take a minute to be really happy for Angel, who never stopped fighting for himself. He has just insisted on telling his story and demanding his rights for all that time. So it's his work that got him out of there. So while most people in places threatened by these risks can rely on mobility for relief, they can evacuate, get in their car, get out of there. People who are imprisoned don't have any control over their movement. They're totally at the mercy of the state to meet all of their needs. Our data told a story, but it didn't tell the whole story. We noticed that many jails and prisons were built, so many jails and prisons were built as the war on drugs was ramping up in the 80s and 90s. Those facilities are deteriorating, just as the climate crisis is deepening. So we're at a turning point where policymakers can either pour millions of dollars into the mass incarceration system to meet the constitutional rights of the people under their watch, or they can consider letting people out and coming up with different ways to think about accountability. Many of the facilities that we noticed with a history of flooding actually did not have high flood risk. If your facility is located high on a hill, it doesn't matter, but its roof is leaking and the infrastructure is falling apart, you're still gonna have flooding. So we're really at a crossroads, and I think it's up to movements like that are represented here today to help decide what happens next.
Thank you for all of that. Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Tamisha Torres Walker, and co-founder, executive director of Safe Return Project. Here from California on very little hours worth of sleep. Richmond, California to be exact. And so I'm just really appreciative to be here. How did I come into this work? I am a formerly incarcerated convicted person. I am the mother of 2 sons who exist in dark bodies, who deserve a world where they could be free, uninhibited by systems that cause them harm. And I, as a formerly incarcerated convicted person, I have been organizing in my community for about 10 years. But when folks say, I've been impacted by jails, prisons, and pollution my whole life. And so growing up in Richmond, Contra Costa County, where we have at least a state prison and federal facility, youth jails and prisons and jails 45 minutes to 15 minutes away from each other. And then we live along the Bay and the Delta, where we call it Refinery Row, where our water, soil, and air is constantly polluted. And Chevron, one of our major polluters, pours millions of dollars into our politics each year to maintain power. And that's been happening for as long as I can remember. So I've been in the work around decarceration, justice, reinvestment, and mass liberation for 10 years. I've only been involved in the work around environmental justice and mass liberation for about 5 years. And it happened as a result of being invited to a Just Transition Framework meeting, where I was the only formerly incarcerated person in the room, and everybody else was climate organizers. And they were talking about a just transition from extractive economies, the extraction of natural resources from our communities and from the earth, and how, you know, we need to preserve, you know, our communities for the next generation to come, with no conversation around the criminal legal system or even the carceral state as an extractive economy in itself, and that it extracts whole people for profit out of our communities. And then in those institutions, our folks are totally neglected, just by way of lack of like healthy food options and everything. I talked to a lot of people who are close to me, and it's just like a friend of mine was in a prison where they experienced valley fever, and I didn't know what that was. And so I'm like, so you taken from your community where investments could happen by way of justice reinvestment to jobs, healthy food, quality education, et cetera, and put in a situation where you can contract a disease and possibly die, where you could have been healthy in your community. And so we started to have a conversation around how do we work with these groups and other groups in our local community to start to shape narratives around just transition that could bring us together, and understand that I'm not only an individual that's impacted by incarceration, but also environmental injustices as well. And so it's really just been a journey to not just think about intersectionality. And the reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of the questions around like, how do police, prisons, environmental justice, climate justice, how do we address the intersections? And my experience, just even in my 10 years of organizing, even around crimmigration, which is the intersection between the criminal legal system and immigration, is that intersectionality is a popular word that we like to use. And we say it because we operate at the peripheral of movement rather than actually working together. And so when we say, what is the intersection between these movements, do we actually mean how we're gonna come together and fight? Or do we just mean how we work peripheral to one another, and as one community wins, another community loses, and we do not think about the impact of our work on, as the gentleman said earlier, our brothers and sisters as a whole. And I learned this because when we were organizing around immigration reform to end our local ICE contract, which we did, our sheriff was able to get $1.5 million that was supposed to go to reentry to keep people out of jails and prisons, to put more people in jails and prisons because he lost his ICE contract. And so we celebrated for a moment, because now we have to figure out, how did we win and lose at the same time? And so most of what I've been trying to do in this space around just transition and mass liberation is to not just talk about the extractive systems, but also to talk about us and how we work together and how we operate within.
Good morning. Is it on? All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very honored to be on the stage at Beyond the Bars for the first time in many, many years. I've missed everybody. All right. So let me dive right in. And I think I'm picking up right where my sister left off. Thank you. All my sisters, actually. Thank you, thank you. Abolition is life in rehearsal. It is the unfolding totality of transitional goals, but they have to be designed for a totality rather than peripherally one to the other. As a principle and practice, abolition must be green. To be green, it's got to be red. And to be read, it must be international. So I'm just going to tell a story to illustrate this. You all know I'm a geographer. I came to that many years after organizing. I was a dropout for a very long time, and the book that Kelly mentioned, I started writing when I was a dropout, not when I was a fancy professor like I am today. All right. I am still a dropout, thank you for acknowledging that. About 22 years ago, a tiny group of abolitionists, and I mean 6 people, set out to stop a prison in California. And one of the waves of organizing they initiated for their campaign started at a tire fire that, while also in rural California, was not adjacent to the proposed prison site. Why? They combined their principles and their curiosity to put into motion life in rehearsal. In retrospect, we could say and do that we were following the lead of organizers whose work we might not yet have known. We were following the work of organizers whose work we might not yet have known. People like Michael Zinzun, who was a member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, a street fighter against the police, who, in the later years of his long career fighting for social justice, started doing work around environmental injustice and environmental racism because he saw a continuum from the organized violence that police laid onto the bodies of Black, brown, and poor people, and the organized violence of abandonment that produced death from asthma and other preventable causes. Or the Mothers of East Los Angeles, a group of Chicana and indigenous women who were prison fighters who stopped a prison in California in the early 1980s, who also asked themselves, why does the state think our kids are going to go to prison? And they realized one reason was their kids missed a lot of school, and they realized the reason their kids missed a lot of school was asthma, and the asthma that the kids suffered from was exacerbated by the fact that the housing project and community they lived in East LA was close to the freeways that were spewing forth diesel that affects or exacerbates restricted airway disease. So this vulnerability to premature death is cumulative, and it compounds many vulnerabilities, as we've heard from all of my co-panelists this morning. And as some young people in Central California summarized it for me many years ago, the problem is police, prisons, and pesticides, or police, prisons, and airborne toxins, whatever their source is, but particularly petroleum. Now, I can't read my own writing. As we know, climate change is propelled by fossil fuel, and I started our story with a tire fire. Now imagine a mountain of 5 million tires burning day and night. It is impossible to use a fire hose to put out a tire fire. The historical geography of the present is the historical geography of people fighting against these kinds of vulnerabilities to premature death. All those tires and all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is resulted from the epochal shift to and dependence on petroleum-powered internal combustion engines, cars, trucks, buses, trains, ships. Most of the vehicles roll on rubber. A bit more than a century ago, Standard Oil, where the Rockefellers made their jillions, and the beginning of the USA as a creditor rather than debtor nation, petroleum-powered vehicles rose hand in hand then with automobiles rose hand in hand with the U.S. as a creditor nation, the rise of Standard Oil. And the automobile that was first among equals was the Ford. Henry Ford's production system standardized car making, lowering the price by learning from weapons manufacturers, particularly Winchester, the guns that were used to kill Native Americans across this continent. Henry learned how to make parts standardized and interchangeable from Winchester. The Ford Foundation, which opened in 1950, the year I was born, started out with the most astonishing wealth imaginable on the planet, and it was the wealth from this car manufacturing that obviously traces back through the history I have so briefly indicated. But those Ford cars needed rubber tires. Henry Firestone and his close-in elites tried very hard to figure out where they could grow the rubber trees to tap the rubber, to make the tires, to sell to Ford for his mass-produced cars to cover this land. And eventually, one of the concessions Firestone got was in Liberia. Liberia in West Africa, which was a settler colony to which the U.S. Colonization Society deported American Africans who had been emancipated, thereby enabling them to have a modicum of freedom, but displacing indigenous people in Liberia in the process. In the 19th century, in fact, abolition had many expressions, and it was effectively captured as a police action reinforced by the British Imperial Navy, who patrolled the high seas and used spots in Liberia as well as Sierra Leone and so forth to place the captives from the ships they had interrupted, who then couldn't go home, but became, as it were, sojourners in yet another strange land. Land grabbing and water grabbing characterizes the establishment of concessions then and now, i.e. it's part of the colonial framework of the global racial capitalism. Agriculture, mining, forestry, all of these extractive land uses come together under this aegis. The rubber tree is from Brazil. In fact, it is a native of the Amazon, the lungs of the earth. And it is able to be grown in a rather narrow range of the Earth's surface, mostly in Southeast Asia, and we could talk about the various wars that have reconfigured Southeast Asia over the last century, but also in West Africa. Large-scale monocropping changes entire systems necessary for well-being, as Kelly was explaining earlier, and as our brother was explaining in the land acknowledgement. All of this activity is cumulative, and as Michael Zinzan and the Mothers of East Los Angeles and that tiny group of abolitionists learned more recently, forces displacements by way of extraction and disappearance and waste. So the historical geography of the future is what we're working on. People organizing to put out that fire did everything they could think of to gather evidence, promote their ideas, and change their fate, which is what, from the ground up, abolition or abolition democracy actually looks like. By rehearsing a different future, those comrades joined forces in this sticky, messy conjuncture where the residues of organized violence and organized abandonment condense and sometimes explode. So that community became part of the anti-prison movement, and the anti-prison movement became part of the anti-environmental racism movement, and all of those things became part of the anti-crimmigration movement. Rather than pretending that it's a military exercise, we show up as allies and then go home to our separate domains. The U.S. military, as we know, has a policy. I think Kelly talked about it. They produce a good deal of global warming, and they are looking for climate refugees to make sure they cannot get to the United States. But organized people got rid of the fire and nearly stopped the prison that I talked about. The key is organization. Organization, organization. If I have time later on, I will talk about some of the kinds of organizations that I see that have an international reach, that are refusing the capture of green by capitalism, that are refusing the demonization of red by by capitalism and are insisting that internationalism from below is how we're going to save ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks so much for all of those powerful, powerful insights. I think that what each of the speakers has made really clear is that the site of the prison itself is what makes some of these connections actually explicit, right? I mean, if we go back to what the kind of circumstances that Aline was actually speaking to, it becomes so clear. Where I'm from in Chicago, I and some other folks who are here teach at a prison where there is an ongoing and continuing water crisis, right? And you know, as just recently, it was detected that there was Legionella bacteria in the water, so people were not able to drink the water, clean themselves with the water, brush their teeth with the water, and this became detected on a Friday. And so our folks were told inside, well, we can get you some fresh water on Monday, so no water over the weekend. And, you know, folks have been organizing mutual aid efforts to get water inside, but yet if they have no access to water over the weekend, they're still faced without any water. So I think that the site of the prison absolutely makes these kinds of connections explicit. But one of the things, Tamisha, I think that you said really struck me, that when you were going to the, well, many things that you said, but one of the things I wanted to ask you and others to speak to is you noted that when you went to the just transition training, that you were the only formerly incarcerated person at the table. And I think that you also spoke to this question of sometimes when we win, we also lose, and how can we ensure that that doesn't happen? And I think we have to make sure that folks who are impacted by these struggles are actually at the table when we're organizing, right? So if you could speak to, you know, how we can ensure, how we can lift up, how we can make sure that we're including currently and formerly incarcerated people in our efforts, and build up that leadership, that would be really great.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, some of the work, so one of the things for Safe Return, so our work is around policy advocacy, community-based research to find solutions to systems, and then justice reinvestment strategies. So when I was invited to this room and we're having these conversations, even like into this second year being at the table, my like climate and environmental justice folks still weren't getting it, right? And it was like, rather than trying to figure out like, okay, it was more like, hey, come to this soul to soul, or like, what it became about is we felt like we were mission drifting rather than upholding the mission around mass liberation in that space. And so we had to step back and say, hey, we have GeoCorp that just opened up around the corner, and they're providing reentry services to prisoners while they're also the same corporation that runs private prisons. How does that happen in our own backyard? And it was very hard to get those folks to understand that while we also want to do a mobilization against Chevron, can we do a mobilization against GeoCorporation in our own backyard? And after a while, a couple people got it, and we did like a barbecue right in their parking lot, talking to people that's going in and out and educating the community. But it also became very clear that these spaces that we're all in, everyday folks are not. And the language we often use in movement spaces are not accessible to our everyday folks. And so it will make sense that I'm the only person at the table, because even the language being used in our movement spaces doesn't work on the ground in our communities. And so what I decided to do was, over the last 18 months, working with the Other and the Belonging Institute of UC Berkeley, is a research project to look at past movements, current movements, And how do we learn from how those movements came together? What was sustainable about them, what didn't work? And like, was there a formula? And if not, then is it really that we need to do narrative change to be able to defeat what we consider dominant narratives? But even that language isn't accessible to our people. And so I think for myself, the goal that I've had over the last 18 months is to create tools that we can use in community with language that's accessible so that we do come to the table. Because I'm not an academic, right? I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, I'm not any of those things. And sometimes, but I've been in these spaces long enough to be able to like interpret what's being said and communicate that out to my community. And so for us, that's what I've learned. The only way to be able to get my folks to the table, even if it's just locally at first, is that I have to make the language accessible, the spaces accessible, and also to recognize that although we're like fighting and organizing around environmental injustices and mass targeted incarceration of our folks, some people are still just trying to get a job, trying to have fresh water, trying to have a roof over their head, trying to make sure that their kids don't get arrested at school, trying to figure out where they're gonna find affordable daycare, because those are the everyday issues. And so my job is to show up and address those everyday issues while inserting that we can also organize in our struggle for mass liberation from these extractive systems. And so I think that's what's been the most challenging for me, but I think that's where people will get it, is when we actually make these movement spaces accessible, because for the most part, for a lot of everyday folks, they're not. And so I think that's been my goal. Hopefully, enrichment with our Just Transition team, we have been incorporating more of that accessible language, bringing folks together, saying like, who is our common enemy? What is our common struggle? And then like, how do we work backwards from there to make sure that we're meeting the needs of everybody within movement while we're fighting for environmental change, as well as against the criminalization of our folks every day. And that's just simply what it is for me. I might write a book one day, but I'm gonna write a book one day with your help about how we make this all happen. But I think that's what it is for me. It's just making sure that I can get our folks to the table.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That really resonates with me, the piece about making the way we approach people more accessible, but also, I'm be real with folks, I spent the better part of my 20s strung out on heroin and doing crimes. So when I'm in a space and somebody comes in and acts in a way that offends or unsettles the room, I'm not getting precious in the way that some people are. Like, I'm not about to see something I haven't seen or hear something I haven't heard before. We need to be able to be uncomfortable, right? As folks who are welcoming new people into spaces or who are entering those people's spaces, right? And understand that we are not going to talk the same way, and that folks are going to maybe show up using language or, framing things in ways that make us uncomfortable sometimes. And getting used to that, I see as a huge impediment for a lot of the folks, the kind of folks you're talking about that are using the language that's not accessible to people. Like, folks in movement spaces need to understand that struggles are not sanctuaries. It's called struggle. It's not comfortable. Like, we have to be able to sit with our discomfort. And at the same time, we have to respect that we're human beings, so we need to process that. And so something that I really appreciated about the Project Mia's Abolitionist Institute that I led the direct action training piece at the past couple of years is at this year's Abolitionist Institute, every day at the end of the day-long sessions, there was a BIPOC processing space. And so all of the folks, the BIPOC folks got to stay after and talk about it. Like, how did things hit them that day? what felt right, what didn't feel right, and that, you know, the organizers could use that knowledge to inform how best to move forward and how to do things the next year, right? If we are creating places for people to learn from each other about what we're feeling and what we're processing and what we're dealing with, then we're not gonna feel like we have to emotionally download in the workspace all the time, right? That's why we end up doing that. There aren't places in the world where we can be heard or where our voices are valued. So when we get into a space where actually we know that people at least kind of take this seriously, they kind of give a damn what happens to us, people seize upon that energy sometimes to insist everything must be right now. You must address me in the most respectful terms possible. We must use the right language to discuss the crisis. Everything in this space must be right. It's not about making a space where everything's right. It's about making a space where we can create constructive relationships and begin the process of learning from each other. Language is a grappling process. And I feel like there's this thing that's happened with a lot of folks where they feel like they've arrived at the right words. Like everything up to now was a struggle to find the right words, and now we have them. And we get to yell at anyone who doesn't use the right words. Language has always been a grappling process. People pulling from history, from their own lives, from what they understand, from the way that language gets misused and then warped out of usefulness, right? We're constantly grappling. So if we understand our conversations with other human beings as a grappling process of trying to find the things between us that we actually want to exist and build those things, and not simply taking a red pen to each other all the time, or correcting each other, or trying to deposit the right ideas in another human being. I don't know anyone whose politics ever changed because someone walked up to them and said, your politics are shitty, use these instead. That's not how anything works. And I'll just close by saying that in my own real life experience of this, it's a matter of, I try to be adaptable. When my collective had to do a direct action training for a group that we knew had a lot of brown men, when we knew to expect some machismo, we talked in advance about, we're gonna have to navigate this, how are we gonna do it? We wanna hold our power and demand respect, but you know, we don't wanna interrupt the work and prevent ourselves from training these people to build this blockade that they wanna build. And so after a long day of showing folks how to use power tools, showing them how we build things, how we deconstruct things, trying to establish we do know what we're doing, one of these guys yells out, where are the men? And I've, have one of my trans sisters standing beside me and another sister standing beside me, and I can feel they're about to melt down. And so I just said, at home, making me dinner. People laughed. We moved on. I established the line, They knew. I was saying, hey, no, actually, I hold power. You don't have to look around for the man. But I did it without derailing the work we were doing together, and we were able to move forward in a good spirit, and I think we need to find more ways to do that. And I think as a disabled person in particular, I know what it is to expect accommodation, and to know that people need to take into account that not everyone moves the same way, and that sometimes we have unexpected needs. And so I try to deal with people nowadays in that same spirit, in terms of what we're learning and how we're understanding each other.
Yeah, I want to build on what Kelly just said, and also, lift up abolitionist thinker Stevie Wilson, who is incarcerated, and kind of bring his voice into the room. Because I think when we talk about making our movement spaces more accessible, I think we also need to think about, how are we making our movement spaces, how are we building our movements with people inside as well. And I know one of the things Stevie says often whenever he has the opportunity to speak to audiences or write is that if we're doing this work, you have to go and you have to be in communication with someone who is incarcerated. You have to go visit a prison. You have to actually see what that is like. So I just want to throw that into the mix as well as something that is really central and important to doing this work and making our spaces accessible, to be thinking about the people who can't actually be here physically with us today. So I want to move and ask Aline to talk a little bit, I think, about, you've been covering the crisis inside the prisons, right? I know Kelly and others have been really active in various mutual aid efforts, right? And I think I spoke about the kind of, collecting, thousands of bottles of water and then bringing them into the prison. But I wanted to, for me, I think I grapple with this question because how do we hold the state accountable if we're doing the work and trying to meet the needs of folks, right? And so I'm wondering if you can talk about any examples, right, when you've covered different crises that hit prisons in different ways after disasters, and what are the ways in which the state maybe has been held accountable or has actually been forced to come in and address the needs of folks?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that has come from so many different directions. I mean, I think one of the most important starting points for what you're talking about is, I guess, organizers, reporters, attorneys, whoever, first listening to people who are incarcerated and taking the things that they're describing, the experiences they're having, the questions that they have seriously. So, there's a lot of gaslighting that happens by, these corrections departments and people inside of them, state officials. So I think first, believing people and starting by responding to the questions and concerns that people inside have has been really important for my work. In terms of examples of accountability, I've seen it come from a lot of different places. I mean, one of the starting points for this project that I described was the work of this group, Fight Toxic Prisons, which every year when there's hurricanes coming toward the Gulf Coast, they're identifying which facilities are in the hurricane's path and calling those facilities, asking if they're going to evacuate, asking what the plan is, demanding evacuations, demanding a response. I've seen that in California as well with wildfires. In terms of the work of attorneys in Texas, the state has been forced to begin to take some steps toward protecting people from heat. They're far from sufficient, but they're, initial steps that are, making real differences in some people's lives. That has come because a number of people have died because of heat-related causes in Texas, and their families pursued lawsuits against the state and were able to find attorneys to represent them. I've spoken to, actually, I mentioned this family, Justin and Casey Phillips, who were dealing with Justin's kidney problem while he was incarcerated in the heat. They would love to go after the state. They cannot find an attorney to represent them. So, that kind of legal pathway has produced results in some cases. There's also these legislative pursuits, the same example in Texas, there's people pushing the state to install air conditioning in that case. In Florida, there's loved ones of incarcerated people that have organized to push for sentencing reform rather than, infrastructure adjustments. So that's another pathway that's happening there. One example that I brought into the reporting that I did on wildfires was this coalition in California called CURB, which includes Critical Resistance, which Ruthie helped start. So they, rather than, California has this huge backlog of repairs, which is impacting people as wildfires come through. We talked about this generator problem. But rather than demand repairs, CURB is demanding the closure of 10 prisons, release of 50,000 people in the next 5 years. They don't want the repairs. They don't want that investment. So, again, these are very different approaches to dealing with these issues. And I think, again, I think it comes back to listening to the people on the ground and what they want and need.
Great. Thanks so much. We've been talking a lot about examples locally, and I'm hoping, Ruthie, that you can kind of help us step back and bring in an international lens and talk about some of the organizing and the organizations that are doing this work. I think you mentioned that earlier, and it would be great if you could do that.
Sure. I just would like to add a postscript. Californians United for a Responsible Budget, CURB, was started by a group of organizations, Prison Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and one or two others. Prison Moratorium Project was inspired by a talk that the late, great Eddie Ellis, whose daughter is here today, gave in the mid-1990s. Where are you, Greer? In the mid-1990s. And he, as my partner Craig Gilmore, who's here, will attest to as well, Eddie's words blew our minds, and we never saw the world the same, even though we were already doing work. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is beware the trap of authenticity. It is not the case that if somebody has been locked up, they understand, and if they haven't been locked up, they don't understand. People have all different ways of coming to consciousness about reality, and there are people who are fighting for prison expansion who are locked up, as well as people who have never been locked up who are fighting for mass liberation. I've been to Yale, I've been to jail. I'm like in the Venn diagram. All right. All right, but I needed to say Eddie Ellis, presente. All right, in international work, there are many, many different dimensions of international work that we can see and understand the very exciting connections between and among. One has to do with, of all people, the nurses. I've been doing some work for the last few years with the biggest union of nurses in the United States, National Nurses United, which is part of a global network called Global Nurses United, who are connecting the urgency of caring for and protecting life at its most vulnerable, whether it's in the emergency, in a lockup, on the road of long-distance migration in detention centers and so forth. One thing that has gotten me really excited about what National Nurses United have done can be read about, actually, if you go to their website, if you have that capacity at your disposal, and see the resolutions that the nurses voted on at their last conference. They have voted against militarism. They have voted against the rise of police budgets. They have voted to support the kinds of things that abolitionists do, even though they wouldn't call themselves abolitionists. To me, it's the work that you do rather than the name you give it that matters. So that's an example. The reach of National Nurses United has taken me and others to what's happening in Brazil. The biggest black country outside of the continent of Africa is Brazil, which has very murderous police, more murderous even than the United States, and the United States tends to be very high on the charts, where people are organizing in urban and rural communities to realize the fundamental conditions of life to have food, shelter, beauty, all of those things. So I'm thinking about what you said about, well, if the issue is daycare, then that's the abolitionist issue. The issue is not to say, all right, drop that and come over here and fight this jail. By working for daycare, the work against the jail proceeds. This is what the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense said. You know, survival pending revolution. Feed the people. And it's not charity, as Dean Spade reminds us, it's solidarity. So another example of such solidarity that I can see internationally is the landless workers movement in Brazil, MST. The landless workers movement in Brazil is, as the name suggests, a movement of people who are in rural parts of that vast country, who do not have ownership or other kind of control of land, who have organized themselves over almost 40 years to seize land, to occupy it, what we call here in New York approvingly to squat on it, in order to make it fruitful for themselves and their communities. And the MST does this, establishing in the tradition of Marronage and Afro-Indigenous solidarity, quilombos, where people establish villages, till fields, grow food, and they are now the biggest producer of organic rice in Latin America. That rice not only feeds people in rural and urban Brazil, again, remind you it's a big country, almost 300 million people, but some of that rice goes under the wall of embargo to feed people in Venezuela, which the US is starving, to feed people in Cuba, which the US has tried and failed to starve since 1959, and elsewhere. And because they have learned how to make the land fruitful through practice, through experiment and trying again, they, like so many revolutionaries of the 20th century, take their knowledge and ideas and ways of being in the world anywhere they're called. They will go to South Africa and work with communities in South Africa where people have built places to live because of really drastic housing shortages, and worked with the communities to make the land fruitful. They go to Indonesia, where people are trying to get rid of single crop, earth-destroying agriculture and make it more varied and fruitful, and so forth. That is what they do. Those are two examples, and I could go on with many more. But the point is here, organized people. We have to infiltrate organizations or organize our own. That is, CURB came from organizing our own. In other cases, it's infiltrate, it's one or the other. Because to go back to that example of the sheriff in Contra Costa County, the most organized people in the United States of America right now in the public sector are the cops. The cops are the most organized. When there is $1 available, they are first in line, they have their plan ready, and they hand it in and they get the money. They've gotten all the COVID relief money in many, many, many places to build jails, to build prisons, and so forth. They're organized. We have to out-organize them. We have to out-organize them.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that, that one of the things that I find really inspiring about some of the work that Ruthie referred to in Brazil, the seizure of land, is the preparation that it takes to reclaim land. And I understood this just a little bit, having been involved in housing reclamation years ago, that you don't just walk up and steal a house, right? You have to put a lot of thought into it. But we're talking about folks finding surreptitious places to plant food all around an area where they want to take for like 6 months ahead of time, growing food and preparing in the periphery, because they know the soil that they're about to reclaim is not good, and it's going to take time to restore it and to be able to cultivate food that could sustain people, that could hold that land. So in the meantime, they are sowing seeds on the periphery and creating that potential for life and that potential to build. And that's something I'd like all of us to think about in the work that we're doing. That we don't just get to charge in and take over everything the way we sometimes feel compelled to, right? What seeds are we sowing? What are we nourishing? What are we creating that will sustain our movements when we retake land and try to make it good again? So just wanted to add that.
I wanted to thank you, and thank you all for everything. One of the things that, like, early on in my organizing, which isn't much because I've been told I'm still a baby, is that an organized lie beats the disorganized truth, is what I've been told. And so when I think about that, is that For so long, even a lot of my community has been convinced that prisons, jails, and policing is what makes us safe. And so, in a lot of ways, we've been lied to about these systems, and then even though we know that they don't make us safe, they don't provide for what we really need in our communities, in a lot of ways, our communities still invest because there's nothing else that folks can imagine that could keep them safe. And so a lot of what is not kind of like, I guess, revolutionary at this point is really having a conversations, like there's national context around reimagine public safety. And almost none of that work talks about healing and like detaching ourselves from these ideals of safety that aren't our own. And so when you say like there's some of the most powerful unions policing and they're first in line for the money, is because in a lot of ways we aren't first in line, and it's because we still believe that they're here to make us safe in a lot of ways. And so I think having these conversations around, well, what we've been doing in our community, saying, well, what is public safety? Or not even public safety, but what makes you safe or feel safe? And then how do we invest in those? And even intergenerational conversations aren't happening in these movements where a lot of our elders don't feel safe in our community. And so a lot of what we've been doing is having conversations, and I was like, when did we drop the ball? And I think that while having those conversations, also not taking full responsibility for what we know white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy created, that we still have to fight. One of the things that's been a challenge as I go back to narrative is like even in Susanville, California, where they're saying they're gonna close a federal prison, the only thing that's offered is either the prison or death. So either the prison or the town dies. That's it. There's no offer that why can't a town thrive without a prison? Nobody is asking this question. It's either the prison and the town thrives or the prison and the town dies. Why aren't we asking what will it take for a community to thrive without a prison? That's the question that we are not asking ourselves. And when we get into California, and I hope my California folks still love me when I leave here. I think we practice restorative justice in California. Don't look at us as the example for reform or progress. People not in California look to California. Almost all of our reform over the last 15 years has carved out violent offenders. I am a violent offender. I haven't benefited from one reform in the state of California. And it's because we continue to other even within policy, even within reform, is that there's this narrative around the deserving and the undeserving. And it is happening in our work in California, which is why a lot of us aren't gonna get free until we decide that everybody deserves to be free. The work around abolition, because I'm still trying to figure out what kind of abolitionist I am. Where like people like, you're an abolitionist. I'm like, am I? I'm trying to get there. Is that I'm like, yes, how do we imagine a just transition, a world without jails and prisons being necessary at all, military or policing? But also, how are we working in community while those systems are still in place? Which is why we can fight for reform and to abolish jails and prisons, but also fight to make sure that the conditions in those jails and prisons are suitable for our brothers and sisters who are in those situations. Because what happens is when we solely focus on what happens when you come home and the idea of not having a jail or a prison, folks are dying from diseases, lack of having fresh water, food, air, all of these things, because we're just, if we allow the conditions to continue to get worse, then we're ignoring our folks on the inside in those conditions. And I know that the fear, right, because these are systems, is that the more that we ask them to invest in these systems, it's going to be it's going to be harder to get rid of them. That might be possible, but why risk a life as a result that we could have saved if we fought for fresh water?
Would it be okay if I said a few additional words about California? I'm not disagreeing with you, but I want to lift something up because this is a golden moment to do it. Starting at least in the late 1990s, when the contemporary abolition movement got some legs, critical resistance, so on and so forth. So at least then, but that came out of years of organizing beforehand. So it's not something was born in September of 1998, but it kind of congealed for the next round. The basics for abolitionist thinking refused carve-outs, refused the idea that anybody locked up should be sacrificed for some greater good in the future. We refused that. So Justice Now was formed. Legal Services for Prisoners with Children had been fighting. Dorsey Nunn was one of the organizers of critical resistance and also the organizer of All of Us or None, right? All of us or none, and so forth. We had these principles that we realized in everything we said and did. But as I said, we were a tiny group then, and the word rose, abolition, and spread, but the principles didn't necessarily travel with it. In the interim, something else happened. Now, I want to say something, I'm going to use some big words, and I'm just asking you to stick with me whether you like big words or not. Everybody likes some big words. Everybody does. Philanthropy is private allocation of stolen social wage.
Yes. Yes.
That's what it is. So the Ford Foundation didn't pay taxes, established itself in 1950, the year I was born. That's wages stolen from all the workers who made all the cars that made Ford rich. Stolen directly by not paying them the wages, and indirectly by not putting that money into taxes that would be spread among all of us. That's what I mean. Philanthropy, I, the Ford Foundation, I, Rockefeller, I, Soros, decide privately how to spend this money that should belong to all of us in the first place. All right? So that's something. But it's also true that I do believe we should take the money and run. If you can get some, do it. But here's the in-between that's very important in this moment, to me. So again, I'm not disagreeing with my sister. I hope I'm agreeing emphatically. Many philanthropists are themselves program officers, maybe some in this room, who have a portfolio, who are trying to bring about something. It's never a revolution, ever. But they're trying to bring about something, some kind of social justice. I had a Ford Fellowship to write my dissertation. I had a Soros Fellowship to write my first book. The center that I run at the City University of New York was initially funded by Ford. They didn't ever tell me what to do or what to say, but they took the bet that somehow I would become a nice left liberal Negro who would want to promote the Democratic Party. Seriously. That's what my future was supposed to be, was to be part of the professional managerial class. That's what I was supposed to become. All right? So philanthropists and the program officers who drift between and among these various foundations put together the groups of funding with the eye of realizing the outcome that will make the world safe for capitalism, but a little bit less unjust. And it's certainly the case that in California, in spite of the more radical demands that abolitionists and abolitionist organizations made, that foundations came in and deflected that and threw money into organizations that would support and amplify the idea that reform requires carve-outs, that reform should not be universal, that there is no universal, or that, to use Connie Rice's words, the founder of the Advancement Project, that we should love the police because politicians are afraid of them. This is the world we live in. So, take the money and run, but remember that in the context of all of these struggles, including in the National Nurses United, there are people who have antagonistically different views, and the question is for all of us whether the energy that is going toward abolition and toward mass liberation is something that we can incite and extend rather than us giving up before the fact and believing, as many people here in the city of New York have come to believe, guided by the Ford Foundation, that the only way to close Rikers is to build new jails.
Aline, did you want to jump in here?
I mean, I'm just so grateful for this conversation because you guys are speaking to so many questions that came up for me as I was reporting this project. And I don't have a ton to add. I just wanted to say some of the things that Tamisha has said about winning and losing at the same time. You know, in Louisiana, where this guy Angel was in ICE detention, something like that played out, you know? There was criminal legal system reform and fewer people being incarcerated in these local jails, but the community needed more. These communities didn't have an alternative or didn't see an alternative, so they turned to ICE detention to meet their budget needs. And suddenly, in around 2018, Louisiana became this like center of ICE detention in the US. It also happens to be a state that is distinctly vulnerable to climate-related problems. So yeah, all these things overlap, and I'm just really grateful for this conversation.
I wanted to quickly ask folks something. Who here has heard of the Red Hill Fuel Storage Facility and the campaign around it? Okay, I see a couple of hands up in a really big room of people who give a damn about justice and climate. So I want to name to you all that a group of folks recently won what was believed to be an unwinnable battle in Hawaii. A coalition of folks beat the US military and forced the shutdown of the Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, which was leaking fuel and destroying local aquifers. So the US military said that national security, we can't close this site. That's usually the end of every conversation. But 5,000 people wound up in the emergency room, and indigenous organizers got together with the affected families. The affected families were mostly military families. This was not a natural alliance. The Hawaiian Islands are some of the most heavily militarized islands in the world. Indigenous people there are very resentful of the military presence. And yet, folks found common ground, common cause, built relationships, and a 4-month pressure campaign did something that virtually everyone thought was impossible. So I all want us to take away from that it is possible, that we can come together with people that we didn't think we could work with, who we would never otherwise want to spend time with maybe, and do amazing things. And also that we didn't know. that the people in this room did not know about that victory, from which there's so much to learn. So I hope, folks, when you leave here today and you look up a lot of the great things people are talking about, I hope you'll look up the Oahu water protectors and the struggle to close Red Hill, and take away what you can from what those folks accomplished. We did an episode about it on Movement Memos. To be honest, most of the good coverage that is not through Truth Out, where I work, is local, because this story is just falling through the cracks. We can't allow that. When the military gave a press conference to announce this historic concession, all the follow-up questions were about Ukraine. We cannot allow this. So amplifying these stories, amplifying when people do work together and work against the security state successfully, that is part of our work too. And I also want to name that Truth Out, my employer, an independent journalism publication, is in great danger right now. It's an abolitionist publication that's been able to survive the decimation of independent news, but algorithms are killing our fundraising right now. And that's intentional. Facebook and Google have targeted independent media for destruction, and it's working. So I just want us to remember the importance of storytelling and of uplifting the stories of people who win, and to remember that we need to keep creating platforms to do that and to keep platforms alive to do that.
I'm so glad that Tamisha raised this issue of carve-outs. And I don't think it's not just happening in California, it's in Illinois, and it's everywhere. And I think it really actually goes back to what Kelly started with, quoting Ruthie, the problem of innocence, right? I mean, that piece of Ruthie's, I mean, it's actually a hard read. It took me a long time to get through it. I finally had to digest it by reading it as if it were a poem. But it's beautiful writing, and it deals with really hard issues that you have to wrap your head around, because Tamisha talked about the dominant narrative, right? It's all around us. And I think Ruthie, in that article, in that piece, is really grappling with and challenging this dominant narrative, this question of innocence, like the question of carve-outs, who's deserving and who's not deserving. So I do want to urge everyone, buy Abolition Geography, but also just read the piece. You can find it online. It's part of another beautiful book, anthology. That's where I had found it. The name escapes me right now. But I think grappling with these questions, these hard issues, is really what we're doing today and what's really been represented on this panel. Sadly, we do have to bring this session to a close, but so happy to be here with all of you. I'm thinking of Grace Lee Boggs right now, and how she said, you know, we're living in a time where we really need to grow our souls, and that's what I think we've been doing here with this conversation, and what I look forward to doing with all of you for the rest of the day. So thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Thank you.